What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about Alaska's vast wilderness. On March 15, 2019, a 12-person research team from the University of Alaska vanished without a trace near Valdez Glacier. Their final radio transmission, recorded at 11:47 p.m., contained nothing but screaming and an unidentifiable sound that acoustic experts still refuse to classify. The search helicopter found their campsite 3 days later. Tents arranged in a perfect circle, all equipment intact, but no signs of struggle. What they did find were footprints, hundreds of them, leading away from the camp in single file as if the entire team had simply walked into the blizzard. But here's what the authorities never released to the public. The footprints weren't human. This is just one of 10 absolutely terrifying true stories we're sharing today, each more disturbing than the last. From the families who disappeared in Nome, leaving behind only security footage of them walking into the tundra like zombies, to the oil workers in Deadhorse who discovered something massive living beneath the permafrost that made the company permanently abandon a billion-dollar facility overnight. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are documented cases with witnesses, evidence, and survivors who still wake up screaming. The research team's bodies were never found, but exactly 1 year later, hikers reported hearing voices calling for help from inside the glacier itself. The voices matched the missing researchers' names perfectly, but the glacier is solid ice that hasn't melted in 10,000 years. Before we dive into these spine-chilling accounts that will forever change how you view America's last frontier, make sure to click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because once you hear these stories, you'll never want to miss another terrifying tale from the darkest corners of our world. Trust me, after tonight, you'll never look at Alaska the same way again. Story 1. The Kodiak Island Stalker. David Morrison thought he was giving his family the perfect Alaskan adventure when he rented an isolated hunting lodge on Kodiak Island for the entire month of October 2018. The weathered cabin sat 40 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dense spruce forest and accessible only by float plane. David, his wife Jennifer, and their twin 15-year-old sons Alex and Marcus arrived on October 3rd with enough supplies to last 6 weeks and dreams of hunting brown bear and catching salmon. What started as a family bonding experience quickly became a nightmare that would leave them forever changed and questioning what truly lurks in Alaska's untamed wilderness. The first sign that something was wrong came on their third night. David woke to the sound of their German shepherd, Rex, growling low and continuous outside their bedroom window. When he peered through the curtains, he saw nothing but darkness, but Rex's hackles were raised and his body was rigid with fear. The dog had never acted this way before, not even around bears at their home in Anchorage. David grabbed his flashlight and rifle, stepping onto the porch to investigate, but found nothing except Rex cowering behind the woodpile, refusing to move despite David's calls. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, and David's breath formed thick clouds as he swept the flashlight beam across the tree line. Everything appeared normal, but an unsettling feeling gnawed at his gut as he noticed how absolutely silent the forest had become. No wind through branches, no small animals scurrying, not even the distant call of an owl. The next morning, Jennifer discovered that someone or something had rearranged their firewood during the night. The neat stack David had organized was now arranged in a deliberate pattern, 5 logs placed in a perfect star formation with smaller pieces spelling out what looked like the word watch. When David examined the arrangement, his blood ran cold. The precision was unmistakable, and the logs had been moved from their original pile over 50 feet away. No animal could have done this, yet there were no human footprints in the frost-covered ground, only strange impressions that looked too large and oddly shaped to be boots. Jennifer wanted to leave immediately, but David convinced her they were overreacting. Maybe it was a prank by locals, he reasoned, though deep down he knew no human could have accessed their remote location without them hearing a boat or plane. By the end of their first week, the psychological warfare had escalated beyond mere property manipulation. Their hunting traps were being systematically triggered and reset in impossible configurations. Snares tied in complex knots that would have taken hours to create, deadfall traps rebuilt with heavier logs arranged in geometric patterns. Most disturbing was the discovery that something had been in their cabin while they slept. Jennifer's journal, which she kept on the nightstand, was found in the kitchen with pages torn out and arranged on the table to spell, "We know you." The handwriting wasn't hers, wasn't any of theirs, but was written in her own pen. Security had become paramount, so David installed motion sensor cameras around the perimeter and barricaded the doors each night with furniture. But the entity seemed to be studying their defenses, learning their routines, always staying one step ahead. The twins, Alex and Marcus, began experiencing vivid nightmares on their 10th night, both describing identical dreams of something tall and impossibly thin watching them through their bedroom window. They claimed they could hear whispers in a language that sounded almost human but with too many syllables, words that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. Jennifer found scratches on their window the next morning. Not random marks, but deliberate symbols carved deep into the glass in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Rex had stopped eating and spent his days hiding under the porch, emerging only when absolutely necessary and never venturing more than 10 feet from the cabin. The dog's behavior was perhaps the most telling indicator that their situation was deteriorating rapidly, as Rex had been trained for wilderness survival and had never shown fear of any natural predator. David's breaking point came during their 3rd week when he discovered that something had been systematically testing their cabin's structural integrity. Support beams showed fresh tool marks, window latches had been loosened, and the propane lines had been tampered with but not damaged, as if something was exploring the cabin's vulnerabilities without wanting to harm them immediately. The methodical nature of these investigations suggested an intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly patient. Their radio communications became increasingly unreliable, filled with static and strange interference that sounded almost like breathing, making contact with the outside world nearly impossible. David's attempts to signal for early pickup were met with responses that seemed to come from their own radio, mimicking his voice but speaking words he never said. The entity's presence became more aggressive during their final week, manifesting in ways that defied explanation. Footsteps could be heard on the roof every night, pacing back and forth for hours in patterns that matched no known animal gait. The sounds were too heavy for a human, but too deliberate for any creature David knew. Jennifer documented temperature fluctuations throughout the cabin, with certain rooms dropping 20 degrees without warning, while others remained normal, creating an atmosphere of perpetual unease. Their food supplies were being manipulated, not stolen, but rearranged in ways that spelled out messages or formed symbols they didn't recognize, but that filled them with an inexplicable dread. Sleep became impossible as the walls seemed to breathe around them, expanding and contracting in rhythm with something they could never locate. The final confrontation occurred on October 28th during a blizzard that had knocked out their generator and plunged the cabin into total darkness. David had been keeping watch by the window when he saw a silhouette moving between the trees, impossibly tall, maybe 9 feet, with limbs that bent in directions that hurt to perceive. It moved with fluid grace despite its size, stopping just at the edge of the clearing where the darkness swallowed its features. Jennifer and the boys huddled in the living room as something began testing each window and door, applying pressure that made the entire cabin groan and shift. The scratching sounds against the walls grew more frantic, more purposeful, as if it was trying to find a way inside through sheer determination. Rex had disappeared entirely, and they could hear his terrified whimpering from somewhere beneath the cabin where he must have crawled to hide. When morning finally came and the blizzard cleared, David made the decision that would save their lives. They would leave everything behind and hike to the emergency cache he knew was located 8 miles south, where they could activate a beacon for immediate extraction. The family grabbed only essential survival gear and started their trek through knee-deep snow, constantly looking over their shoulders as they felt eyes tracking their every movement through the dense forest. The hike that should have taken 4 hours stretched into 8 as they took circuitous routes to avoid the feeling of being herded in a specific direction. Every tree seemed to hide a potential threat. Every shadow could conceal something watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. Their rescue came via Coast Guard helicopter on October 29th, but the pilot reported that something had followed their helicopter for several miles, staying just out of visual range but showing up clearly on radar as a fast-moving object that defied conventional aircraft behavior. David never reported the full extent of their experience to authorities, knowing his account would be dismissed as cabin fever or stress-induced hallucinations. The family sought therapy for months afterward, but the nightmares persist, and Rex was never the same, requiring medication for severe anxiety and refusing to go outdoors after sunset. Jennifer's journal from those final weeks, when recovered by investigators, contained entries written in handwriting that graphology experts confirmed wasn't hers, detailing intimate knowledge of the family's fears and plans that no outside observer could have known. The Morrison family now lives in suburban Seattle, but David still checks locks obsessively every night, and Jennifer has never slept through the night since their return, always waking at 3 a.m. with the certainty that something is watching their house from the tree line that no longer exists in their neighborhood. Story 2. The Nome, Mass Disappearances. The small town of Nome, Alaska, population 3,598, became the center of one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in American history during the winter of 2005. Between September and November of that year, 24 residents vanished under circumstances so bizarre that the FBI classified the case files for national security reasons, and the media was discouraged from extensive coverage. What started as isolated missing person reports quickly escalated into a pattern so terrifying that it challenged everything investigators thought they knew about human behavior, mass psychology, and the very nature of free will itself. The first disappearance occurred on September 18th when Margaret Chen, a 34-year-old schoolteacher and mother of 2, failed to return home from her evening jog. Security cameras from the Arctic Refuge Hotel captured the last known footage of Margaret at 7:23 p.m., running past the building at her usual steady pace. However, at 7:24 p.m., the same camera shows her stopping abruptly mid-stride, turning 90 degrees to face due north, and beginning to walk with mechanical precision toward the tundra beyond the town limits. Her posture was rigid, arms hanging straight at her sides, and her face bore an expression that witnesses later described as completely blank, like someone had turned off the lights behind her eyes. Margaret's husband called police when she didn't return by 10 p.m., but by then she had already walked 15 miles into the wilderness in sneakers and jogging attire, completely unprepared for the sub-zero temperatures that would claim her life within hours. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist brought in to analyze the growing number of disappearances, documented a pattern that defied conventional explanation. Every victim had been captured on some form of surveillance equipment in the moments before their disappearance, and the footage revealed the same disturbing sequence of events. Normal behavior would suddenly cease mid-action. People stopped talking mid-sentence, drivers pulled over and abandoned their vehicles with engines running, children left their toys where they fell and began walking. All victims turned to face north with mechanical precision before beginning their final journey into the frozen wasteland. Most chilling was the complete lack of distress or confusion on their faces. They appeared calm, almost peaceful, as if responding to a summons only they could hear. The investigation took a darker turn when search teams began finding the bodies. Traditional search and rescue operations in Arctic conditions typically recover victims within a mile or two of their last known location, as exposure kills quickly in temperatures that regularly dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. However, the Nome victims were discovered at impossible distances, some over 40 miles from town, having walked in straight lines through terrain that should have been impassable in their inadequate clothing. Even more disturbing was their condition upon discovery. Despite dying of exposure in sub-zero temperatures, their faces showed no signs of pain or struggle. They appeared to have simply laid down in the snow and died peacefully, as if they had reached their intended destination and could finally rest. Janet Kowalski, a 42-year-old postal worker, became the case's most crucial witness when she became the first person to survive the phenomenon that investigators were beginning to call the calling. On October 15th, Janet was sorting mail in the post office when she suddenly felt an overwhelming compulsion to walk north. She later described the experience as hearing her deceased mother's voice calling her name from somewhere in the distance, growing stronger and more insistent with each passing moment. Unlike the other victims, Janet had the presence of mind to call her husband on her cell phone as she found herself walking mechanically toward the town's northern border. Her husband rushed to intercept her, and the recording of their phone conversation captured her confused and terrified voice saying, "I can't stop walking, Mike. My legs won't listen to me. Mom keeps calling me to come home, but Mom died 8 years ago." FBI behavioral analysts were baffled by the psychological profiles of the victims, which showed no common denominators that could explain their susceptibility to whatever was causing the mass exodus. The victims ranged in age from 8 to 73, came from various ethnic backgrounds, had different medical histories, and showed no signs of mental illness or substance abuse. Religious leaders, medical doctors, teachers, laborers, and children all responded to the same mysterious stimulus with identical behavior. Dr. Chen's interviews with the few witnesses who saw victims in their final moments revealed that the affected individuals appeared to be in a trance-like state, unresponsive to their names being called, and apparently oblivious to the extreme cold that should have sent them seeking immediate shelter. The most terrifying aspect of the Nome disappearances emerged when investigators analyzed the linguistic patterns of the few victims who were found alive, but catatonic. 7 individuals were discovered in the early stages of hypothermia and were rushed to Nome's hospital, where medical staff made a discovery that challenged their understanding of human consciousness. The survivors spoke in languages that linguistic experts couldn't identify, not indigenous Alaskan dialects, not any known human language, but structured communication with consistent grammar and syntax that suggested intelligence behind its creation. Dr. Maria Santos, a specialist in xenolinguistics from the University of Alaska, spent weeks analyzing recordings of the survivors' speech patterns and concluded that they were speaking a language that contained mathematical relationships found nowhere in human communication. The government response to the Nome disappearances was swift and suspicious in its thoroughness. Within days of Dr. Santos releasing her preliminary findings, federal agents arrived to confiscate all audio recordings and interview transcripts related to the survivors' linguistic anomalies. The hospital staff was required to sign non-disclosure agreements, and the survivors themselves were transferred to undisclosed medical facilities for specialized treatment. Local law enforcement was ordered to redirect all media inquiries to federal authorities, and journalists who attempted to investigate the story found their access to witnesses and documentation severely restricted. The official explanation released to the public cited mass hysteria brought on by seasonal affective disorder and contaminated water supply, but this explanation failed to account for the impossible walking distances, the uniform behavior patterns, or the mysterious language phenomenon. The disappearances stopped as abruptly as they had begun on November 23, 2005, leaving investigators with more questions than answers and a community traumatized by the loss of 24 residents in less than 3 months. The final victim was 8-year-old Timothy Kowalski, Janet's nephew, who walked away from his elementary school during recess and was found 2 days later 30 miles north of town, having somehow survived longer in the brutal cold than any adult victim before succumbing to exposure. His teacher reported that Timothy had been drawing pictures all week of tall, dark figures standing in the snow, and his final drawing, found in his desk after his disappearance, showed stick figures holding hands in a circle around something he had labeled the calling place in crayon. The long-term psychological impact on Nome's surviving residents cannot be understated, as the community struggled to process a tragedy that defied rational explanation and for which there could be no closure. Family members of the disappeared were left with no answers, no one to blame, and no way to prevent future occurrences of a phenomenon that authorities clearly didn't understand. Support groups formed organically among the bereaved, but even these gatherings were monitored by federal agents who discouraged public discussion of the events. Property values plummeted as residents fled Nome in droves, unable to cope with the constant fear that they might be next to hear whatever call had claimed their neighbors, friends, and family members. To this day, the Nome disappearances remain officially unsolved, though local residents report that strange occurrences continue on a smaller scale. Every winter, a few individuals report feeling inexplicable urges to walk north, though most are now aware enough of the danger to seek immediate help or have family members keep close watch during the darker months. The town installed a comprehensive early warning system with motion sensors and security cameras covering all northern exits, and mental health services have been expanded significantly. However, the underlying cause of the 2005 mass disappearances remains a mystery that haunts Nome's residents, leaving them with the terrifying knowledge that whatever claimed 24 of their neighbors in those dark autumn months could return at any time, and they would be just as powerless to resist its call as those who walked into the frozen wilderness and never came home. Story 3. The Aleutian Island radio operator Coast Guard Petty Officer Marcus Rivera thought his 6-month assignment at the Dutch Harbor Communications Station would be a peaceful way to serve out his final year before retirement. The 47-year-old veteran had spent 23 years in various radio operations across Alaska, but nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter during the winter of 2019 at the remote outpost on Unalaska Island. What began as routine weather reports and vessel tracking communications gradually transformed into a psychological nightmare that would leave Rivera questioning his sanity and the very nature of what was possible in the isolated waters of the Aleutian chain. Rivera's first indication that something was amiss came during his 3rd week at the station, when he picked up a transmission on a frequency that had been officially decommissioned since 1945. The signal came through clearly at 0347 hours on November 15th, cutting through the static with a crisp clarity that suggested a powerful, nearby transmitter. The voice was speaking in what sounded like technical jargon, using military terminology and call signs that Rivera recognized from his extensive training in World War II radio procedures. What chilled him to the bone was that the transmission was coming from Station Zebra 7, a facility that had been abandoned and partially destroyed in 1943 after what military records described as operational complications requiring immediate evacuation and permanent closure. Driven by professional curiosity and decades of experience troubleshooting radio anomalies, Rivera began researching Station Zebra 7 through military archives and local historical records. What he discovered painted a picture of a facility that had been much more than a simple weather monitoring station. Declassified documents revealed that Zebra 7 had been part of Operation Icebox, a classified psychological warfare experiment designed to test the effects of extreme isolation and sensory manipulation on military personnel. The station had been conducting research into what the documents euphemistically called enhanced interrogation through environmental manipulation and psychoacoustic influence, though the specific details of these experiments remained heavily redacted even in the declassified materials. The transmissions became more frequent and increasingly personal as Rivera continued his investigation, evolving from military chatter to direct communication that seemed specifically targeted at him. The voice, which he had initially assumed was some kind of automated recording or radio echo, began using his name and referencing details about his military service that were not part of any public record. On November 28th, the entity speaking from Station Zebra 7 asked Rivera about his tour in Afghanistan, specifically mentioning a classified operation that Rivera had never discussed with anyone, and that officially had never occurred. The Psychological impact of hearing his deepest secrets broadcast from a supposedly abandoned facility 60 miles away was devastating to Rivera's sense of reality. Rivera's attempts to locate Station Zebra 7 physically became an obsession that consumed his off-duty hours and began affecting his performance of regular Coast Guard duties. Historical records placed the facility on Kodiak Island, but modern satellite imagery showed no structures at the coordinates provided in the declassified documents. However, Rivera's radio equipment was able to triangulate the transmission source with increasing accuracy, and the signals were definitely originating from the exact location where Zebra 7 should have been. Weather reports and shipping traffic in the area showed no unusual activity, yet Rivera's instruments detected powerful electrical signatures and electromagnetic anomalies consistent with active radio equipment operating at levels far beyond what any portable transmitter could produce. The breakthrough in Rivera's investigation came when he discovered the personal diary of Lieutenant Commander James Hartwell, the last commanding officer of Station Zebra 7, in a box of donated military memorabilia at the Dutch Harbor Historical Society. Hartwell's journal entries from the final months of the station's operation described experiments that pushed the boundaries of human psychological endurance and explored what he called frequency-based consciousness manipulation. The final entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, detailed the researchers' discovery that certain radio frequencies could create persistent psychic impressions in isolated environments, essentially recording human thoughts and emotions in the electromagnetic spectrum where they could be played back indefinitely under the right conditions. As winter deepened and the Aleutian storms isolated Dutch Harbor for days at a time, the transmissions from Station Zebra 7 became more aggressive and invasive, demonstrating knowledge of Rivera's current activities and personal relationships that no abandoned facility could possibly possess. The voice began mimicking his deceased wife, Elena, using pet names and referencing private conversations they had shared during their 22-year marriage. Rivera's psychological state deteriorated rapidly as he became convinced that somehow the experiments at Zebra 7 had created a permanent psychic recording of everyone who had died at the facility, and these recordings were now trying to communicate with him through the radio equipment. Rivera's commanding officer, Captain Sarah Martinez, became concerned about his mental state when he began filing reports about unauthorized transmissions and requesting permission to investigate Kodiak Island despite weather conditions that made such a trip extremely dangerous. Rivera's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and he was spending entire nights in the radio room, engaged in what appeared to be conversations with empty air. When Martinez reviewed the radio logs, she found extensive records of transmissions that showed no corresponding signals on their equipment, suggesting that Rivera was experiencing auditory hallucinations. However, audio recordings from the radio room captured Rivera's half of conversations that seemed to be responses to information he couldn't possibly have known. The situation reached a critical point on January 8, 2020, when Rivera commandeered a Coast Guard patrol boat during a winter storm to reach Kodiak Island and locate Station Zebra 7. Despite the dangerous conditions, he managed to navigate to the coordinates where the facility should have been located, only to find nothing but empty tundra and the concrete foundations of structures that had been demolished decades earlier. However, his portable radio equipment detected massive electromagnetic activity at the site, and he reported seeing lights beneath the ground that pulsed in rhythm with the radio transmissions. Rivera's final communication before losing radio contact described tunnels under the foundation leading to equipment that's still running, powered by something I can't identify. Rivera was found 3 days later by a search and rescue team, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite, but alive in what remained of an underground bunker that didn't appear on any military construction records. He was delirious and spoke continuously about the voices in the walls and Elena calling him home through the radio. The medical team that treated him noted that he showed signs of prolonged exposure to high-frequency electromagnetic radiation, and his hearing had been permanently damaged by what appeared to be acoustic trauma from extremely loud sounds, though no such sounds were detected by the rescue team. Rivera's recovery was complicated by his insistence that the transmissions from Station Zebra 7 were continuing, though no other radio operator at Dutch Harbor reported receiving any unusual signals on the frequencies he had been monitoring. Psychiatric evaluation revealed that Rivera was experiencing complex auditory and visual hallucinations, but his knowledge of classified military operations and personal details about deceased personnel suggested that his experiences might have some basis in reality that conventional psychology couldn't explain. The Coast Guard quietly transferred Rivera to a medical facility in Anchorage, where he spent 6 months receiving treatment for what was officially diagnosed as stress-induced psychosis brought on by isolation and electromagnetic exposure. After his medical retirement from the Coast Guard, Rivera moved to Arizona and avoided all radio equipment for the remainder of his life, claiming that he could still hear Elena's voice calling to him whenever he was near any kind of transmission device. He never spoke publicly about his experiences at Dutch Harbor, but investigators who reviewed his case noted that his detailed knowledge of Station Zebra 7's classified operations was far more extensive than what could be found in any declassified documents. The facility at Kodiak Island remains officially decommissioned and abandoned, but electromagnetic surveys conducted in 2021 still detect powerful energy signatures from beneath the ground at the exact coordinates Rivera had identified, suggesting that something at Station Zebra 7 continues to operate nearly 80 years after its supposed destruction. Story 4. The Fairbanks Underground Network. Urban explorers Jake Thompson, Emma Rodriguez, and Tyler Chen thought they had discovered the ultimate adventure when they stumbled upon an entrance to Fairbanks' forgotten steam tunnel system in October 2018. The trio, all college students at the University of Alaska Fairbanks with a passion for abandoned places and hidden infrastructure, had been researching the city's underground utilities when they found references to a network of maintenance tunnels that had been built in the 1940s but largely abandoned after the development of modern heating systems. What they expected to be a few hours of photographing old pipes and machinery became a 4-month nightmare that revealed something had been surviving in the tunnels through Alaska's brutal winters, and it had been watching the city above for decades. Jake first discovered the entrance while researching his thesis on Fairbanks' wartime infrastructure development. The original steam heating system had been constructed to serve military installations and civilian buildings during World War II, with miles of underground tunnels carrying heated water through pipes that kept the city habitable during temperatures that regularly dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of these tunnels had been sealed in the 1970s when individual building heating systems became more efficient, but city records showed that many access points had simply been forgotten rather than properly closed. Jake found one such entrance behind the Cheney River State Recreation Area, hidden beneath what appeared to be a maintenance shed that hadn't been opened in decades. Their first expedition on October 12th revealed a tunnel system far more extensive than any municipal records indicated, with branching passages that seemed to connect every major building in downtown Fairbanks through a network of steam pipes, electrical conduits, and maintenance walkways that stretched for miles beneath the city. The tunnels were surprisingly well preserved, with concrete walls showing minimal water damage and steel supports that appeared to have been recently maintained, despite the system's official abandonment 40 years earlier. Most unsettling was the evidence of recent habitation: sleeping areas fashioned from old blankets and military surplus gear, caches of canned food with expiration dates spanning decades, and makeshift tools crafted from scavenged materials that suggested someone had been living underground for an extended period. Emma documented their discoveries with photography and detailed mapping, but her equipment began malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation during their second expedition on October 19th. Digital cameras showed strange distortions in certain areas of the tunnels, with photographs revealing shadows and shapes that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. Temperature readings fluctuated wildly without corresponding changes in the actual air temperature, and electromagnetic field detectors registered massive spikes near the older sections of the tunnel system. Most disturbing was the audio evidence Emma collected. Recordings captured sounds that resembled human speech, but with vocal patterns that seemed physically impossible, suggesting either multiple people speaking in perfect unison or a single voice that could produce harmonics no human throat could create. Tyler's expertise in urban infrastructure helped the team navigate the increasingly complex tunnel system, but his engineering background made him acutely aware that what they were discovering shouldn't have been structurally possible. The tunnels extended far deeper than any utility system would require, with some passages descending over 100 feet below street level into bedrock that predated Fairbanks' founding. These deeper sections showed construction techniques and materials that didn't match the 1940s-era work documented in city records, with stone masonry and metal alloys that Tyler couldn't identify despite his advanced coursework in materials engineering. The implication that the steam tunnel system had been built around or incorporated into a much older underground structure was both fascinating and terrifying. The team's third expedition on November 2nd brought them face-to-face with evidence that they were not alone in the tunnels, as they discovered areas that showed signs of recent occupation and systematic food storage that indicated planning and intelligence far beyond what they would expect from a homeless individual seeking shelter. Sleeping areas were arranged in defensive positions with clear sight lines down multiple tunnel branches, and food caches were hidden in locations that suggested intimate knowledge of the tunnel system's layout and the city's patrol patterns above ground. Most chilling was the discovery of detailed maps drawn on tunnel walls showing not just the underground layout, but the locations of every school, hospital, and government building in Fairbanks, with what appeared to be timing notations indicating when these buildings would have the most occupants. As November's temperatures plummeted and the tunnels became the only habitable space for anyone without proper shelter, the team began to realize that whatever had been living underground was not human, despite the intelligence it demonstrated in its survival strategies and territorial behavior. Their fourth expedition on November 16th revealed drag marks and bloodstains that suggested the tunnel inhabitant had been hunting, with evidence pointing to the systematic capture and consumption of the city's missing persons who had disappeared over the past several winters. Fairbanks police had attributed these disappearances to exposure deaths in a city where homeless individuals regularly froze to death, but the team's discoveries suggested a more sinister explanation for why bodies were never found. The breakthrough in understanding what they were dealing with came during their fifth expedition on November 30th, when Tyler's thermal imaging equipment revealed the true scope of the tunnel network and the creature that had been observing their previous visits from hidden vantage points throughout their explorations. The thermal signature showed something approximately 8 feet tall with a body temperature significantly lower than human normal, moving through sections of the tunnel system that appeared to be sealed but were actually connected through maintenance shafts too narrow for human passage. Most terrifying was the realization that this entity had been tracking their movements during every previous visit, learning their patterns and methods while remaining undetected until Tyler's technology finally revealed its presence. Jake's research into Fairbanks' historical records uncovered disturbing correlations between the tunnel system's construction and a series of disappearances that had plagued the city since the 1940s, with missing persons reports showing a consistent pattern of individuals vanishing during the coldest months when the tunnels would provide the most attractive shelter for anyone desperate enough to venture underground. Military personnel, construction workers, and civilians had all disappeared without explanation during the tunnel system's construction, and their bodies were never recovered despite extensive search efforts. The official explanation cited the harsh environment and dangerous working conditions, but Jake discovered classified military reports that described structural anomalies and personnel losses due to unknown subterranean threats that had required the early termination of several construction projects. Emma's psychological state began deteriorating after their sixth expedition on December 14th, when she reported hearing voices calling her name from deep within the tunnel system and experienced vivid nightmares about being hunted through endless underground passages by something that moved through the darkness with predatory intelligence. Her photography during this expedition captured images that seemed to show the same tall figure in multiple locations, suggesting either incredible speed of movement or the presence of multiple entities working in coordination. The team's decision to install motion-activated cameras throughout the tunnel system revealed footage of their stalker, but the images were so disturbing that Emma refused to continue participating in the project and sought psychological counseling to deal with recurring nightmares about being pursued through underground mazes. The final confrontation occurred on December 21st, during what was supposed to be their last expedition to retrieve their equipment and document their findings for authorities. Tyler and Jake discovered that their motion cameras had been systematically destroyed or repositioned to face the tunnel entrances, suggesting that whatever lived in the depths had been studying their technology and learning to counter their surveillance methods. The entity confronted them directly in the main junction chamber, revealing itself to be something that had once been human, but had been changed by decades of survival in the underground environment into something barely recognizable as having ever been part of the surface world. Its knowledge of Fairbanks' layout, its hoarding of supplies and equipment, and its territorial behavior suggested an intelligence that had been planning and preparing for something larger than simple survival. Jake and Tyler's escape from the tunnels was only possible because Tyler had prepared emergency charges to collapse certain sections if they were pursued, but the explosions they set off only temporarily delayed their pursuer rather than stopping it entirely. Their report to Fairbanks police was initially dismissed as an elaborate hoax, but the discovery of the tunnel entrance and the extensive evidence of habitation forced authorities to take their claims seriously. A joint operation between city police and military personnel from Fort Wainwright resulted in the sealing of all known tunnel entrances and the classification of the underground system as a restricted area, but thermal surveys suggest that the entity survived the tunnel closures and continues to move through sections of the network that remain accessible through natural cave systems and forgotten maintenance shafts. The three students never returned to their urban exploration activities, with Jake transferring to a university in California and Emma requiring ongoing psychological treatment for severe anxiety and claustrophobia that developed after their final expedition. Tyler remained in Fairbanks but changed his major from engineering to psychology, driven by a need to understand how environmental isolation could transform human consciousness and behavior to the extent they had witnessed in the tunnels. The city of Fairbanks officially denies the existence of any extensive tunnel system, but construction workers and utility maintenance crews report that certain areas of downtown still experience unexplained infrastructure problems, with pipes and electrical systems showing signs of tampering that suggest someone continues to access and modify the underground systems for purposes that remain unknown and deeply unsettling. Story 5. The Bush Pilot's Final Flight. Captain Elena Rodriguez had been flying supply runs across Alaska's most remote regions for 18 years when she took off from Deadhorse on March 14, 2017, carrying medical supplies and mail to isolated villages in the Brooks Range. The 41-year-old veteran pilot had logged over 15,000 hours in some of the most challenging flying conditions on Earth, navigating through mountain passes in whiteout conditions and landing on makeshift airstrips that existed more as suggestions than actual runways. Her Cessna 206 had been meticulously maintained, and she had never experienced a mechanical failure in nearly 2 decades of bush flying, which made what happened during her final flight all the more inexplicable and terrifying. Rodriguez's flight plan called for stops at Anaktuvuk Pass, Wiseman, and Bettles before returning to Fairbanks, a routine circuit she had flown dozens of times throughout her career. Weather conditions were optimal with clear skies and minimal wind, perfect flying weather that should have made the trip unremarkable. Her first indication that something was wrong came 90 minutes into the flight when her GPS navigation system began showing impossible readings, indicating that she was simultaneously at her correct coordinates and 200 miles south of her actual position. Radio communications with Fairbanks Flight Service became increasingly garbled with static that seemed to form patterns almost like Morse code, though attempts to decode the interference yielded no recognizable messages. The mechanical failure that forced her emergency landing occurred without warning at 14:37 hours when both her primary and backup electrical systems failed simultaneously, something that aircraft maintenance experts later testified was mechanically impossible given the independent nature of the two systems. Rodriguez's training kicked in as she executed a dead-stick landing in a narrow valley between two ridges, using her knowledge of the terrain to find a relatively flat stretch of tundra that could accommodate her aircraft. The landing was textbook perfect despite the challenging conditions, and Rodriguez initially felt confident that she could survive until rescue teams located her emergency beacon, which should have started transmitting automatically when the aircraft's systems failed. Rodriguez's confidence evaporated when she discovered that her emergency beacon was malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation, transmitting on frequencies that didn't exist and broadcasting audio that contained her own voice speaking words she had never said. The recorded messages played back through her radio described her location with geographic details that were accurate but referenced landmarks that weren't visible from her position, as if someone else was observing her crash site from multiple vantage points and relaying information through her own equipment. Most disturbing was that the voice, while unmistakably hers, spoke with knowledge of her personal history and private thoughts that she had never shared with anyone, including details about her relationship with her deceased husband Miguel that only she could have known. The psychological torment began on her second day when Rodriguez started hearing Miguel's voice calling to her from the surrounding wilderness, using the pet name Estrelita that only he had ever called her during their 12-year marriage before his death from cancer 3 years earlier. The voice seemed to move around her position in a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose, always staying just beyond visual range but close enough that she could make out individual words and inflections that perfectly matched her memories of Miguel's speech patterns. Rodriguez documented these encounters in her survival journal, noting that the voice became more insistent during the coldest parts of the night and seemed to be trying to lure her away from her aircraft toward the deeper wilderness where survival would be impossible. Rodriguez's training in wilderness survival kept her alive through the first week, but her psychological state deteriorated rapidly as the phenomenon she was experiencing became more aggressive and invasive. The voice that sounded like Miguel began speaking about their private conversations, their wedding day, and intimate moments they had shared, using this personal information to create an emotional manipulation that was far more effective than simple calls for help would have been. Rodriguez found herself taking steps away from her aircraft before catching herself, drawn by the desperate need to see Miguel again despite knowing logically that what she was hearing couldn't be real. Her journal entries from this period reveal a woman fighting a battle between emotional desperation and rational survival instincts. The entities revealed their true nature during Rodriguez's second week when she realized that Miguel's voice was being joined by other familiar sounds that had no business existing in the Arctic wilderness. She heard her mother calling her name in Spanish, her childhood dog barking in the distance, and even the sound of her Cessna's engine starting up despite the fact that the aircraft remained powerless and the propeller hadn't moved since her landing. The cacophony of impossible sounds created a psychological assault that made sleep nearly impossible and forced Rodriguez to stuff cotton from her first aid kit into her ears to maintain any semblance of sanity. Her journal entries during this period became increasingly frantic and disjointed, describing her growing certainty that something was systematically cataloging her memories and using them as weapons against her psychological defenses. Rodriguez's breakthrough in understanding what she was facing came when she realized that the entity's knowledge of her personal history was not complete or perfect, but rather seemed to be drawn from her own thoughts and memories in real time. When she consciously thought about Miguel, the voice became more accurate and detailed, but when she tried to empty her mind or focus on technical survival tasks, the voice became vague and repetitive. This discovery led her to develop mental exercises that helped her maintain psychological resistance, including reciting aircraft maintenance procedures and navigation calculations that required focused concentration and left little mental capacity for the entities to exploit her emotional vulnerabilities. The physical manifestations began during her third week when Rodriguez started finding evidence that something was manipulating her campsite while she slept, rearranging her survival gear and leaving footprints in the snow that matched Miguel's shoe size and gait pattern perfectly. Her survival supplies were being systematically moved farther from her aircraft, creating a trail that led deeper into the wilderness in a pattern that seemed designed to gradually draw her away from the relative safety of her crash site toward terrain where rescue would be impossible. Rodriguez documented these manipulations with photographs and detailed measurements, creating a record that would later prove crucial to investigators trying to understand what had happened to her during those 3 weeks of isolation. Rodriguez's rescue came on April 4th when a Coast Guard helicopter spotted the reflection from her aircraft's windscreen during a routine patrol flight, but the pilot reported unusual electromagnetic interference that made radio communication difficult and caused navigation instruments to malfunction while they were in the vicinity of the crash site. The rescue team found Rodriguez in a state of severe psychological distress, suffering from exposure and malnutrition but alive against all odds after surviving for 21 days in conditions that should have killed her within a week. Her rescuers noted that she seemed terrified of her own voice and spoke only in whispers, claiming that speaking normally would call them back and put everyone in danger. The analysis of Rodriguez's aircraft revealed electrical failures that aircraft maintenance experts described as impossible, with wiring that showed signs of systematic tampering despite the remote location and the fact that Rodriguez had been under constant observation by search teams equipped with thermal imaging from the moment her emergency beacon was detected. Her flight recorder contained audio that included her conversations with the entities, but voice analysis experts were unable to explain how the recording captured responses to questions that Rodriguez hadn't asked and conversations with people who weren't present at the crash site. Most disturbing was that the recorded voice patterns matched deceased individuals with perfect accuracy, suggesting either an elaborate hoax or a phenomenon that challenged conventional understanding of consciousness and identity. Rodriguez never returned to flying after her ordeal, moving to Phoenix where she could live in an urban environment with constant human contact and ambient noise that helped mask the auditory hallucinations she continued to experience for months after her rescue. She underwent extensive psychological evaluation and treatment for what psychiatrists diagnosed as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, combined with what they termed anomalous auditory processing syndrome, a condition they had never encountered before Rodriguez's case. Her survival journal, when finally released to researchers, provided insight into a phenomenon that seemed to combine elements of psychological warfare, environmental manipulation, and what could only be described as supernatural predation targeting individuals in extreme isolation. The crash site in the Brooks Range was investigated by multiple agencies, including the FAA, military intelligence specialists, and researchers from the University of Alaska's Psychology Department, but no conventional explanation could account for the evidence Rodriguez had documented or the electromagnetic anomalies that continued to affect aircraft flying over the area. The site remains restricted to air traffic, and pilots flying routes through the Brooks Range report occasional radio interference and navigation problems that match the patterns Rodriguez experienced during her ordeal. Rodriguez herself maintains that something in that valley continues to call out using the voices of people who matter most to anyone who ventures too close, and that her survival was only possible because she learned to recognize the difference between memory and manipulation before it was too late to resist the entity's psychological assault. Story 6. The Iditarod Horror of 1991. Thomas Bear McKenzie was a seasoned musher with 12 years of competitive dog sledding experience when he entered the 1991 Iditarod Trail Sled Dog Race, the grueling 1,049-mile journey from Anchorage to Nome that tests both human and canine endurance against Alaska's most brutal winter conditions. The 38-year-old had placed in the top 15 finishers for 3 consecutive years and was considered a serious contender for the championship, running a team of 12 Siberian Huskies that he had trained personally and knew as well as family members. What happened to Mackenzie and his team between the McGrath and Takotna checkpoints transformed the race into a nightmare that would forever change how he understood the relationship between the living and the dead in Alaska's endless wilderness. Mackenzie's troubles began on March 9th, day 6 of the race, when his lead dog, Kodiak, suddenly refused to continue past a seemingly unremarkable stretch of trail approximately 40 miles east of McGrath. Kodiak was a 7-year-old veteran of 4 previous Iditarods, known for his intelligence and unwavering determination even in the most challenging conditions, making his sudden refusal to proceed completely out of character. The dog planted his feet and began whining in a high-pitched tone that Mackenzie had never heard before, a sound that seemed to communicate genuine terror rather than simple reluctance or fatigue. When Mackenzie tried to encourage the team forward, all 12 dogs began exhibiting the same behavior, backing away from an invisible line across the trail and showing signs of extreme agitation that included trembling, excessive panting, and attempts to turn the sled around despite Mackenzie's commands. After spending nearly an hour trying to coax his team past whatever was causing their distress, Mackenzie made the decision to investigate the area on foot while his dogs remained in their harnesses, ready to depart quickly if necessary. The trail appeared completely normal with no visible obstacles, unusual scents, or signs of predator activity that might explain his team's behavior. But as Mackenzie walked past the point where his dogs had refused to continue, he experienced a sudden temperature drop that seemed to affect only the immediate area around him. The cold was unlike anything he had experienced in over a decade of wilderness travel, penetrating through his Arctic gear as if the insulation had suddenly become useless, and was accompanied by a silence so complete that he could no longer hear his dogs or the wind that had been constant throughout the day. Mackenzie's first encounter with the supernatural occurred when he heard his father's voice calling his name from somewhere ahead on the trail, speaking in the gentle tone that Thomas remembered from his childhood before alcoholism had destroyed their relationship and led to his father's death in a drunk driving accident 8 years earlier. The voice was unmistakably that of Robert Mackenzie, with the slight Irish accent and the specific pronunciation patterns that Thomas had inherited. But the words being spoken were conversations they had never had about forgiveness, understanding, and the regret that Robert felt for the pain he had caused his family. Mackenzie found himself walking toward the voice despite knowing that his father was dead and that following mysterious sounds in the wilderness violated every principle of survival he had learned during his years of racing. The psychological manipulation intensified when Mackenzie's father began sharing memories that only the two of them could have known, including details about Thomas's childhood fears, his relationship with his mother, and private conversations they had shared during Robert's brief periods of sobriety. The voice spoke about being proud of Thomas's achievements in dog sledding, something Robert had never expressed during his lifetime, and promised that they could finally have the relationship that had been destroyed by addiction and anger. Mackenzie documented these encounters in his race journal, noting that the voice seemed to become more convincing and emotionally manipulative the longer he listened, as if whatever was creating the phenomenon was learning what psychological buttons to push to achieve maximum effect. Mackenzie's dogs remained at the invisible barrier throughout his 3-day ordeal, refusing all attempts to bring them forward and showing increasing signs of psychological distress as the hours passed. The animals huddled together for warmth and comfort, something Mackenzie had never observed in their previous racing experience, and several dogs began howling in harmonized patterns that sounded almost musical but conveyed a sense of mourning that was deeply unsettling. Their behavior suggested that they could perceive whatever was affecting Mackenzie even from their position behind the barrier, and their distress seemed to increase whenever Mackenzie moved closer to the source of his father's voice or showed signs of being psychologically influenced by the encounter. The manifestation escalated on the second night when Mackenzie began seeing his father's figure moving between the trees alongside the trail, always at the edge of his vision and never clearly visible when he looked directly toward the movement. The apparition appeared to be wearing the clothing Robert had been buried in, but the figure moved with a fluidity and grace that his father had never possessed during life, when chronic alcoholism had made him unsteady and frequently clumsy. Mackenzie's attempts to approach the figure directly resulted in it disappearing, only to reappear moments later from a different direction, creating a pattern of psychological cat-and-mouse that kept Mackenzie constantly off balance and emotionally vulnerable to the entity's manipulations. Mackenzie's breaking point came on the third night when the entity revealed knowledge that went beyond his personal memories with his father, demonstrating awareness of events that had occurred after Robert's death and displaying understanding of Mackenzie's current life, relationships, and fears that no deceased person could possibly possess. The voice began discussing Mackenzie's financial problems, his concern about his aging mother's health, and his secret doubts about his ability to win the Iditarod, using this information to create an emotional dependency that made Mackenzie increasingly willing to follow the voice deeper into the wilderness away from the safety of the marked trail. The psychological assault was so effective that Mackenzie began considering abandoning his race, his dogs, and his survival gear to follow whatever was calling to him from the darkness. Mackenzie's salvation came from an unexpected source when his lead dog, Kodiak, broke free from his harness and approached the barrier that had contained the team for 3 days, not to cross it, but to position himself between Mackenzie and the entity that had been manipulating him. The dog's protective behavior seemed to break the psychological hold that the phenomenon had established, allowing Mackenzie to recognize the danger he was in and return to his team before he became completely lost in the wilderness. Kodiak's intervention appeared to disrupt whatever force was creating the manifestation, as Robert's voice became distorted and increasingly inhuman before finally falling silent, leaving Mackenzie and his dogs in the normal sounds of wind and forest that had been absent during their ordeal. The race officials who eventually found Mackenzie and his team were unable to explain the 3-day delay or the condition in which they discovered the musher and his dogs, all of whom showed signs of extreme psychological stress despite having adequate food, water, and shelter throughout their ordeal. Mackenzie's account of his experience was initially dismissed as hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and cold exposure, but other mushers who passed through the same area reported similar encounters with deceased family members and feelings of overwhelming coldness that seemed to emanate from the trail itself. The race organization quietly rerouted future Iditarods to avoid that particular stretch of trail, though they never publicly acknowledged the reasons for the change. Mackenzie never completed another Iditarod after 1991, retiring from competitive dog sledding and moving to Anchorage, where he worked as a wilderness survival instructor and spoke privately about his experience to researchers studying anomalous phenomena in isolated environments. His dogs, particularly Kodiak, were never the same after their encounter, showing heightened sensitivity to certain locations and refusing to travel specific routes that had never bothered them before their experience near McGrath. Mackenzie attributed their survival to Kodiak's loyalty and protective instincts, but admitted that he never fully understood how the dog had been able to resist the same psychological manipulation that had nearly cost Mackenzie his life. The area where Mackenzie encountered his father's apparition remains a subject of interest for paranormal researchers and has been associated with several other incidents involving travelers who reported encounters with deceased relatives and friends in the same geographic region. Local indigenous communities have long regarded the area as spiritually significant and potentially dangerous, with oral traditions describing it as a place where the boundary between the living and dead becomes thin during the darkest months of winter. Mackenzie's detailed documentation of his experience, combined with similar reports from other travelers, has made his case one of the most well-documented examples of supernatural encounters in Alaska's wilderness, though official explanations continue to attribute such incidents to environmental stress and psychological factors rather than acknowledging the possibility of genuinely anomalous phenomena. Story 7. The Barrow, Perpetual Night Incident. The northernmost city in Alaska, Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, experiences 65 days of complete darkness each winter, a phenomenon called polar night that transforms the community of 4,000 residents into an isolated outpost where survival depends entirely on artificial lighting and the psychological resilience to endure more than 2 months without seeing the sun. During the winter of 2017, what should have been a routine period of darkness became a community-wide nightmare when the city's power grid began failing in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than mechanical malfunction, and residents started reporting glimpses of massive shapes moving through the streets during the extended blackouts that left entire neighborhoods in absolute darkness. The first power failure occurred on November 18, 2017, 3 days after the sun had set for the final time until January, when the main electrical substation serving the northern residential district shut down without explanation at exactly 3:17 a.m. Municipal engineer David Kaktovic responded to the emergency call and found that the substation's control systems had been systematically shut down in a sequence that required detailed knowledge of the electrical grid's operation. But security cameras showed no human presence in the facility, and all access points remained locked and undisturbed. The backup generators that should have automatically engaged had been disabled through what appeared to be deliberate sabotage, with critical components removed and hidden in locations throughout the facility where no maintenance worker would have placed them. Jennifer Kapianak, a security guard for the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, was conducting her regular patrol of the industrial district when the second power failure struck on November 25th, plunging half the city into darkness during a blizzard that made rescue operations impossible. Kapianak's report described seeing something moving between buildings that was far too large to be human, approximately 12 feet tall and moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible given its size and the harsh weather conditions. Her flashlight beam appeared to be absorbed by whatever she was observing rather than reflecting back, creating a phenomenon she described as looking into a hole cut out of reality itself, something that was darker than the darkness around it. The systematic nature of the power failures became apparent when city officials analyzed the pattern of electrical grid shutdowns and realized that each failure affected a different section of Utqiagvik in a sequence that seemed designed to isolate neighborhoods and create zones of absolute darkness where residents would be most vulnerable. Municipal records showed that the affected areas corresponded exactly to the locations where residents had reported seeing the massive shapes moving through the streets, suggesting coordination between whatever was causing the power failures and the entities that were taking advantage of the extended blackouts. The timing of each failure also corresponded to the periods when emergency services would be least able to respond effectively due to weather conditions and reduced staffing during the polar night. Kapianak's encounters with the entities escalated during the third week of December, when a power failure at the city's water treatment facility required her to investigate the facility alone during a complete blackout that affected the entire southern section of town. Her radio communication with the emergency dispatch center captured audio of what sounded like multiple voices speaking in perfect unison, using words that weren't quite English but were similar enough to create an unsettling sense of almost understanding. The voices seemed to be responding to Kapianak's presence, becoming louder and more agitated as she moved deeper into the facility, and her flashlight began experiencing the same light absorption phenomenon she had observed during previous encounters. The community's psychological state deteriorated rapidly as residents began experiencing mass insomnia and anxiety disorders that city health officials attributed to seasonal affective disorder. But the symptoms were far more severe than anything documented in previous winters and seemed to correlate directly with proximity to the areas affected by power failures. Emergency town meetings were called to address the growing panic, but these gatherings were disrupted by power failures that occurred with suspicious timing, always during discussions of the mysterious sightings and always affecting the specific buildings where meetings were being held. Audio recordings from these disrupted meetings captured the same unified voices that Kapianak had reported, suggesting that the entities were actively monitoring and interfering with the community's attempts to organize a response. The entity's behavior became more aggressive during the final week of December, when residents reported that the massive shapes were no longer simply moving between buildings, but were actively testing doors and windows of occupied homes, creating a siege mentality that forced families to barricade themselves inside and maintain constant vigilance. Thermal imaging equipment borrowed from oil industry operations revealed heat signatures that defied conventional explanation, showing entities that appeared to be significantly colder than the surrounding environment, but that moved and behaved with obvious intelligence and coordination. The images suggested that multiple entities were working together in organized patterns that resembled military tactics more than random predatory behavior. Kapianak's final encounter occurred on January 2, 2018, during what should have been the beginning of civil twilight, as the community prepared for the gradual return of sunlight over the following weeks. A massive power failure affected the entire city simultaneously, something that should have been impossible given the redundant systems and multiple power sources that kept Utqiagvik operational during the polar night. Kapianak was trapped in the community center when the blackout occurred and found herself surrounded by the unified voices, which had become loud enough to seem like they were coming from inside the building, despite her certainty that all doors and windows remained secured. The breakthrough in understanding what the community was facing came when Kapianak realized that the entities seemed to be weakened by any source of artificial light, but only when multiple light sources were coordinated in specific patterns that created overlapping illuminated areas with no shadows where the entities could hide. Her discovery led to the organization of a community-wide response where residents used vehicle headlights, emergency flares, and portable generators to create a network of coordinated lighting that covered the entire city in overlapping circles of illumination. The unified voices became increasingly distressed as the light network was established, and the thermal signatures disappeared entirely once the coordinated lighting system was fully operational. The entity's departure coincided exactly with the return of natural twilight on January 8, 2018, suggesting that their presence was somehow connected to the period of complete darkness that defines the polar night experience in Utqiagvik. Power grid failures ceased immediately, and the systematic nature of the previous disruptions became obvious in hindsight as residents realized how precisely timed and located each failure had been to maximize the psychological impact on the community. Municipal engineers found that all the sabotaged equipment had been repaired or replaced during the final night, with components reinstalled in their proper locations by unknown hands that left no physical evidence of their presence. The official investigation into the Utqiagvik incidents concluded that the power failures were caused by equipment fatigue combined with unusually severe weather conditions, and the reported sightings were attributed to mass hysteria brought on by the psychological stress of extended darkness and social isolation. However, city officials quietly implemented new emergency lighting protocols and established backup power systems that ensure no section of Utqiagvik can ever again be completely without artificial illumination during the polar night. Residents who experienced the events directly maintain that something took advantage of the natural darkness to hunt their community, and that only their coordinated response with artificial lighting prevented a tragedy that could have devastated the isolated city. Kapianak continued working as a security guard, but requested assignment to day shifts only and never again worked alone during the winter months, maintaining that the entities continued to observe Utqiagvik from beyond the range of the city's lighting systems, waiting for another opportunity to exploit periods of darkness and isolation. Thermal imaging surveys conducted during subsequent winters have occasionally detected large heat signatures moving in the tundra surrounding the city, always staying just beyond the range of artificial lighting, but close enough to suggest that whatever threatened Utqiagvik in 2017 remains in the area, patient and intelligent, waiting for the community to let its guard down during the long darkness of future polar nights. Story 8. The Glacier Bay Research Anomaly. Dr. Amanda Foster led a team of 6 climate researchers to Glacier Bay National Park in August 2018, with the mission of extracting ice core samples from the Marjorie Glacier to study climate patterns dating back 15,000 years. Foster, a glaciologist with 12 years of Arctic research experience, had conducted similar operations throughout Alaska without incident, but the discovery they made while drilling into the ancient ice would force the immediate evacuation of their research station and result in the permanent classification of a section of Glacier Bay as a restricted zone. What started as routine scientific research became a nightmare that challenged everything the team thought they understood about the biological history of North America and the things that could survive in frozen suspension for millennia. The research station was established on a stable section of the Marjorie Glacier where ice thickness measurements indicated layers of frozen precipitation dating back to the end of the last ice age, providing an unprecedented opportunity to study long-term climate data from one of Alaska's most pristine environments. Foster's team included Dr. Michael Chen, a microbiologist specializing in extremophile organisms, Dr. Sarah Williams, a geochemist with expertise in ice core analysis, graduate students Jessica Torres and David Kim, and technical specialist Robert Johnson, whose job was to maintain the drilling equipment and handle the specialized storage systems required for preserving ice core samples. The operation was expected to take 6 weeks and had received full support from the National Park Service and the National Science Foundation. The first indication that their drilling operation had encountered something unusual came on August 15th, when the ice core samples from the 800-foot depth began showing discoloration that didn't match any known geological or atmospheric phenomena. The ice at this level should have been crystal clear with occasional trapped air bubbles, but instead showed dark striations that appeared almost organic in nature, with patterns that reminded Dr. Chen of cellular structures he had observed in microscopic organisms. Chemical analysis revealed the presence of proteins and nucleic acids that shouldn't have been able to survive in frozen conditions for the length of time represented by the ice core's age, suggesting either contamination of their samples or the discovery of biological material with preservation properties that defied current scientific understanding. Dr. Williams's geochemical analysis of the contaminated ice revealed isotope ratios that were inconsistent with any known natural process, indicating that whatever had been preserved in the ancient ice was not from Earth's normal biological systems. The organic material showed signs of complex molecular structures that appeared to be artificially engineered rather than naturally evolved, with genetic sequences that contained information patterns far more sophisticated than anything found in terrestrial organisms. Most disturbing was the discovery that the biological material was not completely dormant, showing metabolic activity at temperatures and conditions where no known life form should have been able to function. The containment breach occurred on August 22nd when a power failure in the research station's refrigeration systems caused the ice core samples to begin melting faster than the backup cooling systems could compensate for, releasing whatever had been preserved in the ancient ice into the station's atmosphere. Within hours, the team began experiencing symptoms that initially resembled altitude sickness or food poisoning, but rapidly progressed to include neurological effects that suggested exposure to some form of biological agent that could affect human brain chemistry. Dr. Foster documented the progression of symptoms in her research log, noting that team members were experiencing shared hallucinations, synchronized behavioral changes, and apparent telepathic communication that violated everything she understood about human consciousness and individual identity. Jessica Torres was the first team member to show signs of complete psychological transformation, speaking in languages that linguistic analysis later revealed contained mathematical concepts and scientific principles that were far beyond her graduate-level education in atmospheric science. Her speech patterns changed to include vocalizations that required throat modifications no human should have been able to produce, and her knowledge of the research station's equipment suddenly included understanding of systems and procedures she had never been trained to operate. Dr. Chen's attempts to study Torres' condition were hampered by his own deteriorating mental state as he began experiencing memories and knowledge that belonged to other team members, creating a collective consciousness effect that made individual decision-making increasingly difficult. The biological transformation accelerated when David Kim began showing physical changes that included alterations to his skeletal structure and the development of additional sensory organs that appeared to be growing beneath his skin without causing pain or obvious medical distress. Dr. Williams documented these changes with photography and medical scans, but her records became increasingly incomprehensible as her own consciousness became integrated into the collective entity that the team was becoming. The research logs from this period contain scientific observations written in handwriting that shifted between all 6 team members within single sentences, as if multiple people were sharing control of individual bodies to record their transformation from different perspectives simultaneously. Dr. Foster's decision to activate the emergency evacuation beacon came when she realized that the entity controlling her team was systematically accessing their knowledge and memories to understand human civilization and technology, using their combined expertise to learn about the outside world and plan what she could only describe as an invasion or colonization attempt. The biological agent released from the ancient ice was not simply preserving organisms that had died millennia ago, but was actively using the research team as hosts to gather intelligence about modern human society and infrastructure. Foster's final coherent radio transmission described her growing certainty that whatever had been frozen in the glacier had been waiting for exactly this kind of scientific contact to begin its expansion into the contemporary world. The military evacuation of the Glacier Bay Research Station occurred on August 28th, when Foster's emergency beacon was detected, but the helicopter crew reported that the station appeared to be completely abandoned, despite thermal readings that indicated 6 human heat signatures inside the main building. When military personnel entered the facility wearing full environmental protection suits, they found the research team arranged in a circle around the melted ice core samples, all 6 individuals breathing and showing vital signs but completely unresponsive to external stimuli. Medical examination revealed that their brain activity showed synchronized patterns that suggested a single consciousness distributed across multiple bodies, with neural firing sequences that were identical down to the millisecond timing between all 6 individuals. The research team was transported to a classified medical facility where they remained in the synchronized catatonic state for 3 weeks, before gradually returning to individual consciousness with no memory of their experiences after the containment breach. Extensive medical and psychological testing revealed that they had retained knowledge and abilities that they shouldn't have possessed, including advanced understanding of quantum physics, molecular biology, and engineering principles that were far beyond their original areas of expertise. Most disturbing was their shared ability to communicate telepathically with each other over distances of several miles, a phenomenon that persisted for months after their rescue and gradually faded as their brain chemistry returned to normal human parameters. The Glacier Bay research site was permanently closed to scientific access and designated as a restricted military zone, where regular monitoring ensures that the ice core drilling site remains frozen and undisturbed. Satellite surveillance detected ongoing anomalous electromagnetic activity in the area for several months after the incident, suggesting that whatever had been released from the ancient ice continued to remain active until winter temperatures refroze the exposed biological material. Dr. Foster and her team were sworn to secrecy regarding their experiences and reassigned to research projects in temperate climates, though they maintain informal contact with each other and report occasional episodes of shared consciousness during periods of high stress. The classified report on the Glacier Bay incident concluded that the research team had encountered biological material of unknown origin that had been preserved in glacial ice for thousands of years and possessed the ability to create collective consciousness networks in human hosts through airborne transmission. The report recommended that all future ice core research in Alaska be conducted with enhanced containment protocols and that drilling operations exceeding certain depths require military oversight to prevent accidental release of potentially dangerous prehistoric organisms. The biological material recovered from the research station was transferred to the CDC's Maximum Security Laboratory in Atlanta, where it remains in frozen storage under conditions designed to prevent any possibility of accidental exposure or release into the general population. Story 9. The Anchorage Medical Mystery. Providence, Alaska Medical Center's emergency department in Anchorage handles over 50,000 patients annually, making it one of the busiest trauma centers in the state and the primary destination for medical emergencies throughout south-central Alaska. Night shift nurse Patricia Wong had worked in the emergency department for 8 years, treating everything from wilderness injuries to urban violence, but nothing in her extensive medical experience prepared her for the series of patients who began arriving at the hospital during the winter of 2016, all claiming to have died in Alaska's wilderness, but somehow making it to the emergency room alive with no memory of how they had traveled hundreds of miles from their last known locations. The first impossible patient arrived on December 3, 2016, when 34-year-old hunting guide Mark Stevens was brought to the emergency department by ambulance after being found unconscious in the hospital parking lot during a snowstorm. Stevens claimed he had died 3 days earlier after falling through ice on a remote lake near Talkeetna, approximately 100 miles north of Anchorage, while guiding a hunting party that had confirmed his death and reported his body lost beneath the ice to Alaska State Troopers. However, Stevens appeared at Providence Hospital with core body temperature, blood pressure, and brain activity readings that were medically impossible for someone who had been submerged in near-freezing water for an extended period. Yet his clothing was still wet with lake water, and his body showed signs of prolonged hypothermia exposure. Wong's initial assessment of Stevens revealed medical anomalies that challenged her understanding of human physiology and survival, as his vital signs indicated that he had indeed experienced clinical death but had somehow returned to life with full cognitive function and no apparent brain damage from oxygen deprivation. His blood work showed cellular changes consistent with extreme cold exposure and oxygen deprivation that should have been fatal, but his neurological responses were completely normal, and he demonstrated perfect recall of events up to the moment he fell through the ice. Most disturbing was Stevens' insistence that he remembered dying, describing a period of consciousness during which he observed his own body beneath the ice while feeling himself being pulled towards some distant destination by a force he couldn't identify or resist. The second case occurred on December 18th when 42-year-old pilot Janet Morrison arrived at the hospital on foot, walking through the emergency department doors despite having been declared dead in a plane crash near Denali National Park 5 days earlier. Morrison's aircraft had been located by search and rescue teams with her body inside, burned beyond recognition in a post-crash fire that had consumed the entire wreckage. Yet she appeared at Providence Hospital with severe burn injuries that were healing at an accelerated rate and showing tissue regeneration patterns that medical science couldn't explain. Her flight suit bore evidence of the fire that had supposedly killed her, but her injuries were consistent with someone who had survived the crash and received immediate advanced medical treatment rather than someone who had died in the flames. Wong documented Morrison's case with extensive photographs and medical testing, noting that the pilot's burn injuries were healing visibly during her time in the emergency department, with new skin tissue forming at a rate that should have taken weeks or months rather than hours. Morrison's account of her experience included detailed descriptions of the crash site and the surrounding terrain that were later confirmed by investigators, but she also described a period after her apparent death during which she felt herself being carried by something invisible through the wilderness toward Anchorage. Her navigation knowledge and survival skills couldn't explain how she had traveled over 200 miles through some of Alaska's most challenging terrain in winter conditions while suffering from severe injuries that should have been immediately fatal. The pattern became undeniable when 3 more impossible patients arrived within a 2-week period, all with similar stories of death in Alaska's wilderness, followed by unexplained arrival at Providence Hospital with medical conditions that defied conventional understanding of human survival limits. Wong's detailed documentation revealed that all 5 patients showed identical cellular anomalies in their blood work, including the presence of proteins and enzymes that weren't found in normal human biology, but that seemed to be facilitating their impossible survival and accelerated healing. The patients also demonstrated shared psychological changes, including enhanced sensory perception, perfect recall of traumatic events, and an unusual calm acceptance of their impossible circumstances that suggested some form of neurological modification. Dr. Richard Yamamoto, the emergency department's chief physician, initially dismissed Wong's concerns as coincidence and measurement error, but became deeply troubled when he reviewed the medical evidence and realized that 5 separate patients were showing identical biological anomalies that had never been documented in medical literature. The hospital's administration was reluctant to report the cases to health authorities due to concerns about credibility and potential negative publicity, but Dr. Yamamoto's growing conviction that they were witnessing some form of unknown medical phenomenon led him to begin his own investigation into the patients' backgrounds and the locations where they claimed to have died. Wong's investigation into the patients' stories revealed that all 5 death sites were located in regions of Alaska where indigenous communities had long-standing oral traditions about spirits or entities that could return the dead to life under specific circumstances, usually involving individuals who had died while alone in the wilderness and whose bodies were never properly recovered by their communities. The geographic distribution of the death sites formed a rough circle around Anchorage with a radius of approximately 200 miles, suggesting that whatever was responsible for the patient's impossible survival had a specific territorial range and was systematically bringing them to the city's primary medical facility for reasons that remained unclear. The patient's synchronized disappearance occurred on January 15, 2017. When all 5 individuals left the hospital simultaneously during the night shift, despite being in various stages of medical treatment and recovery. Security cameras captured them walking together through the emergency department and exiting through the main entrance, moving with identical posture and gait patterns that suggested coordinated behavior rather than individual decision-making. Their medical monitoring equipment showed that their vital signs became perfectly synchronized in the moments before they departed, with heart rates, brain waves, and breathing patterns matching exactly across all 5 patients before the signals were lost when they moved beyond the hospital's monitoring range. The search for the missing patients led investigators to discover that they had returned to their original death sites, where their bodies were found arranged in circular patterns that corresponded to indigenous burial traditions, but showed signs of recent disturbance that indicated the patients had somehow prepared their own final resting places before dying again. The medical examiner's reports confirmed that all 5 individuals showed evidence of their original fatal injuries alongside the accelerated healing that had been documented during their hospital stay, as if they had been given temporary reprieve from death to complete some unfinished purpose before being allowed to die permanently. Wong's detailed case files were confiscated by federal authorities who classified the medical records and required all hospital staff involved in treating the impossible patients to sign non-disclosure agreements, preventing public discussion of the cases. The official explanation cited experimental medical treatments being tested by military researchers, but this explanation failed to account for the patients' claims about their deaths or the geographical patterns that connected their original incident locations. Wong was transferred to a different department within the hospital and discouraged from pursuing further investigation into similar cases, though she maintained private records of her observations and continued to watch for patients with similar medical anomalies. The Providence Hospital Emergency Department implemented new intake protocols that required detailed documentation of how patients arrived at the facility and verification of their identities through multiple sources, procedures that were officially described as insurance compliance measures, but that seemed designed to identify and track individuals whose presence at the hospital couldn't be easily explained through conventional transportation methods. Wong reported several additional cases over the following years that showed similar medical anomalies and impossible survival stories, but these patients were immediately transferred to undisclosed military medical facilities before she could conduct thorough documentation of their conditions. The long-term impact of the impossible patient cases on Providence hospital staff included increased rates of anxiety and depression among emergency department personnel, many of whom requested transfers to other departments or left the hospital entirely rather than continue working night shifts where they might encounter similar medically inexplicable cases. Wong continued working at the hospital, but required ongoing psychological counseling to cope with her experiences and the knowledge that something in Alaska's wilderness was capable of returning the dead to life for purposes that remained unknown and potentially threatening to anyone who became too curious about the phenomenon she had documented during that terrifying winter of impossible patience. Story 10. The Deadhorse Permafrost Entity. The Prudhoe Bay oil fields at Deadhorse represent one of the most isolated industrial operations in North America, where temperatures regularly drop to -50 degrees Fahrenheit and workers maintain critical infrastructure in conditions that can kill exposed humans within minutes. Carlos Hernandez had worked as a maintenance supervisor at the facility for 6 years, overseeing the complex systems that kept oil flowing through pipelines despite the brutal Arctic environment, but nothing in his extensive experience with heavy machinery and extreme weather conditions prepared him for what his crew discovered beneath the permafrost during routine maintenance operations in February 2019. What started as a simple repair job became an encounter with something massive and intelligent that had been living in the frozen ground for an unknown period, ultimately forcing the permanent abandonment of a billion-dollar facility that had operated successfully for over 4 decades. The first indication that something was wrong came when drill bit number 7 began experiencing resistance patterns that didn't match any known geological formations in the Prudhoe Bay area, requiring replacement every few hours instead of the normal operational period of several days. Hernandez's crew was attempting to repair a section of pipeline foundation that had been damaged by frost heaving, a common problem in permafrost environments, but the drilling equipment kept encountering what felt like hollow spaces beneath the ground, where solid rock should have been located according to geological surveys. The drill bits that were recovered showed wear patterns that suggested contact with something harder than steel, yet the core samples brought up contained only normal permafrost soil and ice with no indication of the material that was destroying their equipment. Seismic monitoring equipment installed to track the drilling operation began detecting vibrations that followed patterns too regular to be natural geological activity, with rhythmic pulses that occurred every 18 seconds with mathematical precision that suggested artificial rather than natural origin. The vibrations increased in intensity as the drilling operation continued, and the frequency patterns began to change in ways that seemed responsive to the crew's activities, as if something beneath the ground was aware of the surface operations and was reacting to the intrusion. Hernandez documented these anomalies in his maintenance reports, noting that the seismic activity seemed to be originating from depths far below the foundation repair zone and was affecting a much larger area than their limited drilling operation should have influenced. The breakthrough occurred on February 18th when drill bit number 12 broke through into what appeared to be a massive underground cavity, causing the drilling rig to suddenly drop 18 feet before the crew could shut down the operation. Core samples from this depth brought up material that defied identification, including what appeared to be organic matter that had been preserved in the permafrost but showed cellular structures unlike anything in terrestrial biology. The organic material was warm to the touch despite being brought up from permanently frozen ground, and chemical analysis revealed complex proteins and nucleic acids that contained genetic information patterns that were far more sophisticated than any known life form. Hernandez's decision to send remote camera equipment into the cavity revealed the existence of an underground space that extended far beyond what their equipment could explore, with walls that appeared to be lined with the same organic material they had discovered in the core samples. The camera feed showed evidence of construction or modification that suggested intelligence, with passages that had been deliberately widened and reinforced using techniques that didn't match any human engineering methods. Most disturbing was the movement detected by the remote cameras. showing glimpses of something massive shifting in the darkness beyond the range of their lights, accompanied by sounds that were captured by the camera's audio equipment but that defied identification or classification. The entity's awareness of the surface operations became undeniable when drilling equipment throughout the facility began experiencing systematic failures that occurred in sequence rather than random patterns, suggesting that something was methodically disabling the infrastructure from below ground in a way that demonstrated detailed understanding of industrial operations. Hernandez's crew discovered that support pillars for critical pipeline sections had been undermined from beneath, with tunnels that had been excavated with precision that allowed the structures to remain standing while being rendered fundamentally unstable. The excavation work showed tool marks and techniques that were far more advanced than conventional mining methods, and seemed to indicate that whatever was beneath the facility had been studying human construction methods and learning to counter them. The psychological impact on the maintenance crew became severe, as workers reported feeling watched during their duties and experiencing shared nightmares about being pursued through underground tunnels by something that moved with impossible size and agility through spaces that should have been too confined for any large creature. Hernandez documented incidents where multiple workers reported identical dreams and visions, suggesting some form of telepathic communication or psychological influence that was being projected from the entity beneath the facility. Equipment operators began refusing to work alone and demanded constant radio contact with supervisors, creating operational difficulties that made routine maintenance increasingly dangerous and inefficient. The entity's direct assault on the facility occurred on March 2 when seismic activity increased to levels that threatened the structural integrity of the main processing plant, with vibrations that seemed to target specific support points that would cause maximum damage if the foundations failed. Hernandez's emergency inspection revealed that underground excavation had undermined virtually every critical structure at the facility, creating a network of tunnels and cavities that stretched for miles beneath the installation and connected to natural cave systems that hadn't been detected by previous geological surveys. The scope of the excavation work suggested that the entity had been preparing for this assault for months or possibly years, systematically weakening the facility's foundations while remaining undetected by routine maintenance operations. The final confrontation came when Hernandez led a team into the main cavity to install monitoring equipment that might help them understand what they were dealing with, only to encounter the entity directly in an underground chamber that appeared to have been modified into some form of lair or control center. The creature was approximately 20 feet in length with multiple appendages that allowed it to move through the tunnels with fluid grace, and it demonstrated intelligence by communicating through vibrations that created recognizable patterns in the facility's seismic monitoring equipment. The entity's apparent attempts at communication suggested that it had been trying to warn the surface operations away from its territory, and that the systematic sabotage had been defensive rather than aggressive behavior. Hernandez's report to facility management describing the entity and the extent of underground excavation that had compromised the installation's structural integrity resulted in the immediate evacuation of all personnel and the emergency shutdown of oil production operations. Corporate executives initially dismissed the report as stress-induced hallucinations, but geological surveys confirmed that the facility's foundations had been systematically undermined to the point where continued operations would be extremely dangerous. The discovery that something intelligent and powerful enough to excavate miles of underground tunnels was living beneath one of America's most important energy production facilities created security concerns that required immediate federal involvement. The military investigation of the Deadhorse facility revealed evidence that supported Hernandez's account of a massive intelligent entity living in the Permafrost, including thermal imaging that detected a heat signature consistent with a large living organism moving through the underground tunnel system. Audio monitoring equipment captured sounds that matched Hernandez's description of the entity's communication attempts, with complex vibration patterns that seemed to contain mathematical relationships and structured information, The investigation concluded that the entity posed a potential threat to critical infrastructure and recommended the permanent abandonment of the facility rather than attempting to remove or contain something that had demonstrated the ability to systematically destroy industrial installations from beneath the ground. The Prudhoe Bay facility was officially closed due to geological instability and foundation problems, but satellite surveillance continues to monitor the site for signs of activity from the underground entity that forced the abandonment of one of Alaska's most productive oil installations. Hernandez was relocated to operations in Texas with a substantial severance package and confidentiality agreement preventing public discussion of his experiences, though he maintains that the entity was defending its territory rather than acting aggressively, and that coexistence might have been possible if corporate interests had been willing to acknowledge the intelligence and rights of something that had been living in the Arctic long before human industrial operations arrived. The site remains permanently restricted, and similar facilities throughout Alaska have implemented enhanced geological monitoring systems designed to detect signs of underground excavation that might indicate the presence of similar entities in other permafrost regions.